Let's get talking about some numbers on your EQ. In terms of the frequency spectrum, we have 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz. We're going to cover all the threes in this class: 30 hertz, 300 hertz, and 3 kilohertz. We're going to break them down individually in terms of how they contribute to your mix. Let's jump in and talk about it. So these are really important numbers. The reason I'm starting with 3 is because I think they are 3 of the most important numbers to get started with. At the end of the day, you could break it down. All the 2s are quite important. All the 1s are quite important. We're going to cover 3s, and in the next class, we're going to cover 1s. I think that is a very great place to start in terms of foundation. So let's talk 30 hertz. When you're down in the 30 hertz range, you are definitely in sub territory. You are below bass frequencies. They are not so much heard as they are more felt. So if we were to take something like analog, a simple synth within Ableton, and play a low C, C sharp, and D, what you'll find is that we're down around this 30 hertz area. Now this line right here, this is 30 hertz, and you can see that in the little box right here. Like right here is 30 hertz. And when I'm playing that low D, we get this 30 hertz. When I'm down on the C sharp and the C, we're also down in that territory. Now, I said it's more felt than heard, and right now you're probably thinking, but I can hear it, no problem. It's because there's all these other overtones happening over top. But if we switch it to a sine wave, you'll see it's much more subtle. Something like this. You probably can't hear it at all, right? It's one of those things where you would need either a subwoofer or really good headphones. Even then, the headphones are probably doing something a little fishy. You want to be working with a bigger speaker system and or with a sub. But as a general rule that I have for myself, this D, for example, really low is at around 36 hertz. I actually don't compose any music where I'm using something below this low sub D. That's because a lot of bigger systems are tuned so that they might be able to hit around 30 hertz, but even then there's usually some roll off. In other words, if you want to get the most power from those low notes, when you start to go below that D, it starts to, on some systems, drop off a little bit. So I'm cautious. I make sure that most of the bass music that I create, D is the lowest note. This is why a lot of electro and electro house, for example, in the early 2000s was written quite often in the key of D, so that in clubs you were accessing some of the most powerful low frequencies. If you want to play it more safe, you could go E or F as your main keys. That's going to be a little bit higher up. That's really common in drum and bass. Once you get to G as your low note, now a lot of home systems are able to recreate that low pitch. So that might be the low end that you would want to explore in terms of pop music. So pop music, I tend to be around this G, drum and bass, E and F, but electro house and just a lot of really sub-frequency heavy music, I'll be down around that D. And that D is right around 30 hertz. Again, it's 36 hertz, but I wanted to mention that as you get closer and closer to that actual 30 hertz, I think C sharp is 34, C is around 32, you really start to get this roll off of energy. So do keep in mind that when you're playing around in those low sub frequencies, the key of your song really does make a difference. Ideally, you wouldn't want to write a song in B minor hoping to hit a B below this low C. You're going to be down in around that 20 and change hertz sort of area, and most systems aren't even going to be able to play that anyway. It's garbage frequencies, it's artifacts, but as a cautionary starting point, I would recommend having D as your lowest note in the sub frequencies, knowing that it's sitting a healthy amount above 30 hertz at about 36 hertz, and it's going to be heard quite well on a lot of big club systems. Over to 300 hertz. Let's take one of the filters that we have on our master, and I'm going to turn one off, and I'm going to turn the other to be a band pass at 300 hertz. Now, we could be at 300 or around 300, but this 300 hertz range tends to be where muddiness happens. There's often a lot of buildup of thick frequencies, the low end of orchestral instruments, the low end of guitar and bass, and harmonic elements. They're going to sort of pile up in this 300 hertz area and cause some issues. Now, every style is a bit different with how they treat this area. Some styles are more open to it. We can have a bit of muddy buildup and it adds to this analog warmth sort of sound. Other styles, we need to get as loud as humanly possible, so we have to really cut a lot out of this area that has a lot of energy but not a lot of use. So if you want to crank up the sub and crank up the bass, you have to take that energy from somewhere else. And in this case, 300 hertz is a good place to start looking. Let's listen to our mix at this 300 hertz. I'm going to take the resonance up to 30%. You can see that kind of puts it level with this line here. So here's our mix with that filter. You can hear a lot of the harmony in here. Listen, if I get rid of the harmony, and that feels like as a little submix quite groovy. We can hear some of the kick, a little bit of the layer of the clap slash snare, even a bit of that melody is poking down around here. But the harmony, when I add it, everything gets cloudy and a little bit tough to hear. So I'm gonna go into my harmonic part here, pull up around just above 300 hertz in this case. It's actually up closer to 400 hertz, this little build-up area here. Take that out. And when we listen back with the full spectrum open, it's not going to sound entirely different, but we got a little bit of that mud taken care of, and that's going to allow us to push our mix a little bit louder and give us a bit more clarity on smaller speaker systems. Let's give it a listen. So 300 hertz, watch out for mud. Again, put a bandpass filter on your master. Listen just to 300 hertz. I do this later in the mixing stage when I'm kind of starting to tweak everything at the very end after I've composed everything. Then I'll kind of really hone in and listen to what's happening there. I'll start with just the drums and the bass and make sure that those are sounding appropriate together as a little submix. And then I'll bring in every other instrument one by one, or sometimes eliminate them one by one, but generally bring them in one by one. And what you'll hear is one, maybe, or two instruments that you add might all of a sudden add way too much energy to that area. We want to be able to hear the bass and the drums in and around that area. We don't want other things clouding that too much. And then we're up to 3 kilohertz or 3000 hertz as our next area of focus. You might remember that when I was showing you the Fletcher-Munson curve, I was mentioning that around 3 kilohertz is where our ears are most sensitive. So what I want you to take out of that is if I was to solo this harmony part, I'm going to create a separate EQ just so things are really clear and easy for you to see. So we're going to pull in another EQ8. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create at around, let's say, 100 hertz or so, I'm going to create a large bump up and back down. I'm going to do the same thing at this 3 kilohertz, and you'll see that this is much more sensitive. I don't need to drag it up super high to get a pretty significant change in terms of how we're hearing that change. So let's go for it. Sounds like this. All right, now up here. Do you hear how much more sensitive our ears are to the adjustments in around this area? When you're doing any EQ adjustments around 3 kilohertz, I would say a little can go a long way. You don't have to do these huge boosts because our ears are sensitive to this area. You don't need to exaggerate things so much. As another example, what if I was to take a shelf down here? Listen to this difference. Significantly huge EQ move, and we're only getting something that sounds modestly louder. If I was to do the same thing way up here in the air frequency, pull it back even. Okay, now we're starting, you can see right around here that we're even starting to kind of almost dip into that 3 kilohertz area just on the bottom end. But watch this, as I move it towards 3K, overwhelming. So I want you to make sure that around 3 kilohertz, you have a lot of information that is very clear. You want to make sure that main elements like voice, your melodic elements, these are very clear in and around this area. After all, our hearing is sensitive in this area, so it's going to pick up really easily from across a patio or down the hall from someone listening to music. That is where the intelligibility is going to really translate in your mix. But at the same time, you have to approach it with caution. You can't do too much in that area or it gets very bright and brittle and a little bit too overbearing. Let's try on our overall mix, adding an EQ and playing around a little bit with this area of 3 kilohertz, adding and subtracting. In other words, boosting and attenuating. On an EQ, when we subtract, we are attenuating. So we're over here around 3 kilohertz. Let's give it a listen. So this is dull, and this is way too much. It's very harsh. Dull, harsh. I haven't even gone to the extremes. Like I haven't even pulled it up the full 12 decibels. So if your mix is feeling a little dull, you might want to be adding a little bit of this 3 kilohertz area. I would recommend even go pretty wide with this, not too wide, but wide enough that it's a gentle brush stroke of an EQ move. And if you find that your mix is too bright, you can pull down a little bit around this area. But keep in mind, you don't want to jump to this master EQ first. Let's say your guitar sounds great. Your bass and drums sound great, but your voice is a little too bright. Well, take the 3 kilohertz down from your voice, not from the overall mix, because now you're going to sacrifice the tonal qualities of other instruments. However, if, for example, your speakers are quite dull and you've mixed as well as you can on them, and then you listen in the car and everything feels too harsh, maybe your speakers in the room that you're in just aren't giving you the right information, so you've added, over time, too much of this 3 kilohertz sort of buildup. That would be a good time to apply this EQ move to your overall song. And to be clear, this is sort of dipping our toes into mix bus processing, where we're taking the entire mix and we're making changes, but it's also in and around the area of mastering. We'll be talking about mix bus processing and mastering in much more granular detail outside of the context of this course, but this is one of the first sort of introductions to mix bus processing and mastering in terms of when you add an EQ move to everything, you're trying to smooth out and balance out the mix. And that's a big part of what your mix bus processing is going to be all about, as well as your mastering. So there it is, 30 hertz. We want to keep things no lower than 30 hertz, and some good key centers to play around with in terms of sub information would be D minor. You could even stretch a little bit lower, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. 300 hertz, watch out for mud. 3 kilohertz, watch out for dullness or harshness. So that's it for this class on the threes, where we have 30 hertz as the low end of our sub-frequencies, 300 hertz where you want to watch out for mud, and 3000 hertz or 3 kilohertz where you're going to watch out for dullness or harshness and adjust accordingly. So this class was on the threes. Our next class, we're going to talk about the ones. I'll see you there.